Let me start. The National Gallery's engagement with Nordic art begins exactly 40 years ago in 1984 with the exhibition Danish Painting, the Golden Age. The first time we really address these issues. And it was also, we're very proud of this, the first exhibition on the Danish Golden Age outside of the Nordic countries. Very interestingly, an exhibition on a similar theme and almost the exact same title, L'Âge d'Or, La Peinture Danoise, opened at the Grand Palais in Paris approximately 6 weeks later. So they were, in a sense, competing exhibitions. The Danes were very generous to both of us. Both were marvelous exhibitions. The tone was very different. The Paris exhibition, the first thing you read about it was that it was under the auspices, indeed, under the control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Quai d'Orsay. It was a state occasion. The Queen came to open it on a state visit to France. There was an official dinner at Versailles, of course, diamonds for miles. It was some sort of political strategy, probably having to do with getting all the pegs in a row for the European Union. The exhibition that opened 6 weeks earlier at the National Gallery, our director at that time, Michael Levy, if you read his introduction, says, my curator, Alistair Smith, came to me and said that it would be great fun to do this exhibition and introduce this art to a British audience. And our friend Casper Monrad, our late friend, the curator of the Statens Museum in Copenhagen, will help me. So we began as we meant to go on, that is in a very casual way, building friendships with our colleagues in the Nordic countries, curators, scholars, dealers, etc. And we have carried on in that way with series of acquisitions over the years. We also began to buy pictures in the mid-'80s, all of them Danish, interestingly. It was only later that we began to move ahead, and I want to show you a few of the things we've been doing in recent years. In 2016, Asbjørn Lunde, the New York lawyer of Norwegian descent, who had assembled an extraordinary group of Norwegian pictures, including 12 Johann Christian dolls, which he hoped would be able to assess that career as it did. In 2016, he offered both us and the Met at the same moment one picture, take your pick. We were very keen to have this, the lower falls of the Labrafoss of 1827, based on an oil sketch on one of Dahl's many trips home in the summer to Norway. He paints this, though, in his studio in Dresden. As you'll remember, the studio next door, Caspar David Friedrich, and this very close friendship between the two of them. It is a very finished picture, which was, we're unclear, either bought by or commissioned by a Mr. Bracebridge, a Brit who we know had a depot or a warehouse on the Thames in the East End, and also other warehouses at Newcastle on Tyne. So clearly he was involved in shipping. But what's so extraordinary is that as early as 1827, a middle-class Brit was aware of what was going on in Scandinavian painting and brings this picture, probably the first doll ever in this country. We also have friends who are very keen that we move ahead with active acquisitions in the Nordic field, this extraordinary portrait on loan from a private collector here in London, showing Kupka's a cousin, a baker named Ryder. It's been on loan to the National Gallery now for many years. It's one of the very few paintings of a working class man with great directness, of great presence on the screen, and rather elegantly smoking a cigarette, I might say. And so that early 19th century collecting, filling out of the collection, has continued here. But more recently, we have moved on. The Peter Balka gift from Griandani Katz, this extraordinary artist working in the most experimental manner, spreading this, those of you who know the picture, it's very small. It's on a lump of wood, is the best word I could use to describe it, in which he's allowed the paint to flow quite freely until it's suggested a seascape to him. And then he adds the touches like the ship, the birds, that turn it into a picture. But it is this extraordinary moment of experimentation with paint to derive an image from it, to let the paint itself suggest what the image is going to be. Highly experimental. And this is one of the aspects of Nordic art we have become most concerned with. That is formal experimentation in the second half of the 19th century. And here, I don't know if many of you saw it. I know certainly Marianne saw it back in 1998, Suzanne Paget's great exhibition in Paris on Lumière du ciel, Lumière du terre, in which she takes the five most experimental Nordic artists at that moment and shows them doing their experiments. They include Schierbeck. There's a whole room of the self-portraits, beginning with very representational, and by the time you got around to the other side of the room, almost invisible. She's almost disappeared into her own art. Carl Friedrich Hill, showing the importance that in the 20th century that so-called outsider art would play. These, drawings of a madman, if you will, except opening up so many doors. Strindberg, his most encrusted paintings, but leading into the photographs of the stars, so that you're seeing things in new ways that nobody in Paris was doing quite yet. And then later, and it was probably the first exhibition really to do this, of late Munch, these hugely inventive, open, free late landscapes. So that has, for me as a curator, been probably the most influential exhibition I ever saw, and thought about how are we going to present these Nordic artists. This has led to acquisitions like our great Galen Kalala, the Lake Kaitali of 1902. We were later able to do an exhibition bringing together the four versions, as well as several other studies of Kaitali in the work. Pictures in which the way in which the brushstrokes are laid down is also the content of the picture. Quite extraordinary the way in the silvery brushstrokes, horizontal brushstrokes, interrupt the vertical brushstrokes, and out of that, the painting is created. Now, I would suggest that 98% of the people coming to the National Gallery had never heard of this artist, Akseli Gallen-Kallela, knew nothing about him. But people make up their own minds. Within 2 years, maybe 3 years, this picture by an unknown artist was the second best-selling postcard at the National Gallery, second only to Van Gogh sunflowers. So it shows you that people, you know, take what they find and work with it. So we have been expanding in this realm, particularly in terms of experiment for the past several years now. But I want to end because so much of your book concerns Canada, with the extraordinary Tim Gardner, whom we were able to show several years ago. Tim, most famous for his early watercolors of his drunken brothers and his drunken brothers' frat boy friends acting out, behaving badly. As he moves in the early 20th century, he's trying to get back to what I would call the sublime. His father was a famous geologist whose subject was mountains, and he goes back to doing mountains, but he can't go, all of his works are photo-based. They're watercolors based on photos. He can't just go back to painting the Rockies or whatever it is. He has to go there by appropriating photographs from travel brochures. This is a photograph advertising your winter ski vacation. And yet he moves it so far beyond it. The skier, he goes right back to Friedrich. I began mentioning Friedrich, to Friedrich's wanderer overlooking a sea of fog. They're up on the mountain looking out over the mountains. Maybe it's the only way, this young Canadian artist is showing, maybe it's the only way we can actually get back to the sublime. So I will leave it there, showing you some of the directions we're moving in.
Thank you, Chris. Okay. So I thought I would just take the next few minutes before we get into the conversation to kind of give a bit of a walkthrough and a talk through of some of the artists that are core to the book. It's obviously what I've spent the last 8 or so years working on, and so I thought it only pertinent to share some of that with you today. You'll note from the title that it's not just about Scandinavia, but I thought, again, for the sake of 5 minutes, I will just share some of the Nordic works that are central to this book. And so for those of you who sort of aren't familiar, you know, for me, the impetus behind this book was to really provide an eco-critical study of Scandinavian and Canadian landscape painting, feeling that it was something that was missing from the scholarship, something that art historians had gotten close to doing, had gotten close to sort of teasing at this idea. And when we think about sort of the historiography of landscape art history in the Nordic countries, we think back to the early 1980s with Kirk Varnedo's Northern Light, with Roald Narsgaard's Mystic North, Dreams of a Summer Night, which took place here in London. And these are really core exhibitions that shaped the conversation over the last 30, 40 years around Nordic art history. Again, in the late 1990s, there's Torsten Gunnarsson's Nordic landscape painting and Michel Fakos's Nationalism and the Nordic Imagination, which again sort of kept this conversation going, but in much a similar vein. And landscape painting becomes reduced to something that is symbolic, that is national, that is about romanticism. And I came along and was like, well, I want to look at the environment. For me, there's this wonderful quote that Torsten Gunnarsson writes in Nordic landscape painting, and it's writing about a Prince Eugen painting called The Forest. And he says that the location is irrelevant, that the environment is irrelevant to how we understand this painting. We know it's painted in Someland. Therefore, if we know that information, surely it's important to how we should understand this work. So that for me was really the motivation. The motivation was to restore how we think about landscape painting in the context of the environment, to take an environmental history approach to landscape painting. So my first chapter is all about this idea of wilderness. It's a very prevailing motif in the study of Canadian art history, as well as Scandinavian art history. And what I'm really interested in with this is how problematic it is. You know, for example, this cover for Svenska Turistföreningens årsskrift by Axel Törneman is quite literally sponsored by Shell Oil. And yet it was used to represent Swedish tourists to get out into the Swedish landscape, particularly the northern landscape, which during this time was being mined and exploited. But what I find really interesting is that the the shell connotations here have been completely overlooked. That is irrelevant to how we should be seeing this work if you were to ask an art historian from 30 years ago. And so what this first chapter and what really the book is trying to do is debunk this idea of the wilderness trope of these environments being unexplored, unvisited, unlived in, uninhabited. And I think this ties up really nicely with what my colleague Bart will be speaking about shortly, is that there are a lot of sort of untold histories within Nordic art history, and especially when it concerns landscape painting, that there is a lot more to say than just what has been said, and that a conversation around landscape painting has to engage the idea of wilderness as a problematic trope. And while it may be one that artists are sort of associating themselves with, that doesn't necessarily make it correct. And so from that, so I took a very thematic approach to the study of landscape painting. When you're looking at Canada and Scandinavia in tandem, you can't but see similarities, thematic similarities in their work, as well as sort of tonal compositions that are tonally comparable. And so in taking a thematic approach, it was an opportunity to debunk and move away from this preoccupation with national identity, to think beyond geographical borders, to think across latitudes. So this chapter was, it's Emily Carr and Gustav Fjärstad, two artists you wouldn't immediately think to pair together, West Coast Canada with West Coast Sweden, bordering Norway. But it was really a chance to think about forests as sites that were visited, that not these scary, intimidating, dark spaces, but rather landscapes that for these two artists were fundamental to how they operated. And so for Gustav Fjärstad, one of the things that is particularly interesting about his work is his emphasis on snow scene. He's one of the greatest proponents of the snow scene in Swedish art history, but also perhaps what isn't visible. And so that for me is, again, what are the stories we could be telling around these paintings that aren't immediately obvious to the viewer? I'm realizing now this isn't actually a terrible example to have put on the screen to make this point. But in a lot of his work, we see animal footprints. We see ski tracks, neither of which are visible here, but there are other ones that do support this claim. And, for me, it's a real way of exploring artist biography, of exploring the ways in which artists experience the landscape in Sweden, especially. And I will admit there is a bit of a bias towards Sweden in this book. My family moved there over 20 years ago, and so my personal preferences definitely do seep into the narrative that I am telling, but they are more broadly applicable across the Scandinavian region. And I think what's also important to note with this book is that it is not the Nordic region as a whole. It is not comprehensive. It is dipping its toe into waters that we might continue to think with. So a bit of Canadian content as well. I felt I couldn't do the discussion of Scandinavian art justice without also introducing the way in which I think about it. And so one of the artists that is really important to, in my opinion, to Swedish art history, but also to the way in which we might think about Swedish art history in a more globalizing, in a more circumpolar context, is Helmer Östlund. This is an artist working in northern Sweden. He lives in Sundsvall. He lives in Norrland. He's traveling further north. If you were to go to the National Museum in Stockholm, he is described as Sweden's Lapland painter, which is a problematic name in itself. But I think it's really interesting for thinking through these kind of northern extensions that are emerging in Swedish art history, that this is not about the center of Stockholm, that we have Gustav Fjärstad operating in Arvika near the Norwegian border. And we have a lot of Swedish artists during the first half of the 20th century working in the north of Sweden. And therefore, the narratives of nationalism become very problematic when you're thinking about indigenous lands and you're thinking about indigenous peoples who are inherently being displaced from the landscapes that are being represented as indicative of Sweden as a whole. And what for me is really interesting between the comparison between Helmer Östlund and Tom Thompson is honestly sort of artist approach. I mean, they're similar visually, but it's also the way in which they're working. They're working with small sketches. They're working on sketches on board. They're working on plein air, and thinking through the ways in which artists might come at similar compositions without necessarily having been influenced by each other. If you know the history of Swedish art or Scandinavian art in North America, there's this wonderful exhibition that takes place in 1912 to 13, where the group of 7, of which Tom Thompson was associated, not a part, because he died rather young, they see this exhibition in Buffalo, and it has a great influence on the way in which they work as artists. But for me, what was really interesting was to go beyond the artists that were included in this show, to extend the conversation around Canadian and Scandinavian landscape painting beyond just the historiography of exhibitions in North America. And so I mentioned earlier again about thinking through mining and the histories of environmental history. And I'm just to quickly share a few examples. So Axel Sjöberg's painting The Great Falls of Luleå River. 4 years after this was painted, it was turned into a hydroelectric dam, completely destroying the waterfall. That history has not yet been explored properly. And then we have sort of these interests, more scientific interests in the aurora, in ice. The one on the right you can currently see at Ben Elwes Fine Art. It's on show until the end of August. I really recommend seeing it because it's really interesting, again, for thinking about a female artist in the Arctic, for thinking about the fascination with glaciology. Glaciology is emerging as a discipline in 1909, where women are finally allowed to be involved in this discourse, and with auroral observations, which have become very interesting with the International Polar Year in the 1880s, and continues to be really important within Arctic environments and artists' work. So these are, again, representative of 2 separate chapters within the book. And so I'm going to end there so that I can pass on to my colleagues. But yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, I'm here to stir the pot a little bit. I am going to speak sort of generally about art history and Nordic Empire. And this, a lot of, I guess what I'll say, I don't know, I look like I am the person delivering this knowledge. I'm speaking it, but a lot of the knowledge we'll talk about has been really collective, particularly because I was part of a 16-part member research group about art history and Nordic colonialism that was based at the University of Copenhagen for the past 4 years. And we had members from all the different Nordic countries, including also Faroe Islands, Chattanooga. We had Inuit working with us. We had Sami scholars and art historians working with us. We also worked a lot in the Virgin Islands. So we also had Caribbean partners trying to think about what is the intersection between Nordic art and empire. I'm sure maybe for many of you, you might not be accustomed to ever thinking about Nordic empire really at all, let alone in an art historical space. So what I wanted to do today, really briefly, was to just look at some images from the 19th century, especially, because the way we think about, I think, 19th century Nordic art history is not only national, but in this strange isolationist inward-looking phase when in the 19th century, there are also empires. There are revolutions in the Caribbean that impact the empire of Denmark, Norway, right? There is the colonization of Greenland, or what is also known as Greenland, that also starts the 18th century into the 19th century. So I have chosen a couple of artworks that I have come across, both working collectively with this research group and thinking about what the 19th century is, based on artworks that haven't always really been documented or well studied. This is a painting you see by Jens Eddie Carl Rasmussen. He's a Danish painter. This painting is in the collection of Nuuk Art Museum. So Nuuk is the capital of Greenland, or of Greenland. So if you haven't ever been to Nuuk, you might not see the 19th century images that exist and depict the Arctic and depict these kind of far reaches of what Nordic Empire is. So this is a painting you see of a family. There is snow on the mountain, but it's actually summertime, which we know because the family are rowing an open skin boat called an umiak, and they are traveling from one village to another, probably to visit their family. There's a really beautiful attention to the materiality of this boat. This is made from marine mammal skin. So he's also very interested. This detail in real life is really stunning. So I wanted to show this painting just to establish that there exists quite a large corpus of images of the Arctic that are imperial by Nordic artists in the 19th century. But there are also images by Arctic indigenous artists in the 19th century. So on the right is a pouch made of de-haired sealskin. This is known as a tepesivik, which is a tobacco pouch. And so this is a vessel that a Kalaalleq woman made. It's dated around 1810. And it shows 3 different umiak boats of hunters who, one has harpooned a whale. This is a colonial scene, which we know because there are flags, and these European building outposts on this kind of rocky shoreline. And I really love this comparison because on the one hand, we have a Danish European artist's interest in Inuit life and in the materiality of sealskin, but also an Inuk artist's perspective of sealskin as an artistic material. And also the fact that it's a tobacco pouch also hints towards the ways in which the Arctic and the indigenous Arctic is entangled with the global plantation, right? And the consumption of tobacco, and thinking about how is tobacco getting from tobacco plantations into the Arctic. That's a longer story. But there are also, through the mechanisms of empire, that indigenous artists also learn European methods, or Inuit artists travel to Copenhagen and also enroll at the Royal Academy. You can't necessarily tell by looking at the list of students who are Inuk or who are European because they have Danish names. This is photographs of images by Stefan Muller. And on the right, you see him seated at a chair. He mostly painted landscapes, but actually the majority of his extant work that we know is figurative. And then behind him is his wife, Hansine. I really love this image of Stefan in his seat looking at his sketchbook because he has this 3-piece suit. But if you look closely, he also has sealskin kamit, or sealskin boots. The other exciting thing about this photograph is that it's taken by John Muller, who is his brother, who is the first professional Inuit photographer. So there is a complex layer, I think, of meanings here. And then I just showed you 2 paintings that are by him that are in the National Museum in Nuuk. We've also been thinking a lot about the Virgin Islands, the 3 islands of St. Croix, St. John, and St. Thomas. They have been part of the United States since Denmark sold them in 1917. And here on the top left actually is a painting that was just auctioned, I think in September or October. It's dated to around 1850, which is really important. That's about 2 years after Moses Gottlieb helps agitate for the abolition of enslavement in the Caribbean, in the Danish Caribbean. And so if this is true, this might be one of the earliest images that we have of Virgin Islanders, of Black Virgin Islanders in the 19th century. And then on the bottom is a sketch made by a Danish artist, Hugo Larsson, who comes to the Virgin Islands. And this is a sketch of him planning what was never realized, but was going to be a large canvas painting about Fireburn, which is this large labor revolt led by 4 women in the Virgin Islands agitating against their terrible conditions they lived in after slavery was already abolished. So I think the fact that there are also Danish artists who are interested in recording Caribbean revolutionary history is not something you would expect to be in what we consider Nordic art history to be, but it exists. And then on the right, this is just a painted calabash bowl that is by a Black Virgin Islander artist. I'm not sure which island it's from, which is also part of the problem. So as we're also thinking about what Nordic Empire is, we also are confronted with the vast amount of work that just the basic kind of archival work of understanding what these objects are, where are they, what do they mean, and also how we can return them, especially to their communities of origin, right? Because some of these, like this calabash bowl, they sit in Copenhagen on a dusty shelf. They're not displayed, and they would be much more meaningful in the Virgin Islands. And then lastly, really pushing the boundaries of Nordic art history is this is a painting on the right by Magnus von Wright, who is a famous Finnish artist in the early 19th century. And Finland in the 19th century, I'm sure as many of you know, is part of the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire also expands into Alaska in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And the majority of the officers and naval force that the Russian Empire recruits come from Finland. And so you actually have a very large archive of Alaska Native objects in Finnish collections and images by Finnish artists of Alaska, which is something, it's like we've gone so far beyond what we thought was possible. But then at the same time, when we realized that, right, this book is also putting Canadian and Scandinavian landscape into conversation, it really does begin to turn into this truly circumpolar kind of field. And maybe, right, the ways in which the circumpolar is this transnational space, maybe that is one of the new directions of Nordic art history. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, so I've been working on a 5-year project since 2021, acquiring Nordic works on paper for the British Museum. And a selection of these works will be in an exhibition at the museum next year. The project is financed by the AKO Foundation, who sponsored the 2019 Munch exhibition at the British Museum. And after the show, our Department of Prints and Drawings was approached by the foundation, who generously gave us a large amount of money to build up our holdings of Nordic works on paper. So this is an exhibition from scratch and echoes the collecting policy of the museum when I first joined at the beginning of the 1990s, when areas of the collection were identified as being weak. And there was a concerted effort to purchase works in that area, resulting in an exhibition and the publication of a scholarly catalogue. So far I've bought almost 400 works by Nordic artists. I wasn't aiming to buy 400, I was only aiming to buy about 200, but it was an irresistible, it's such an irresistible project, and the more works I found, the more I wanted to buy. Anyway, so I bought about 400 works by Nordic artists from the 1940s to the present, and the British Museum will now have probably one of the best collections of Nordic works on paper outside Scandinavia. So what you're looking at is the possible title wall for the exhibition. And these works are by Mamma Andersson, Sweden's most famous contemporary artist. She's a painter who also makes prints. The print on the left she printed herself, and the one on the right she made at a print workshop showing the area near the Arctic Circle where she grew up. So that's to kind of give you a sort of nice intro to the Nordic world. So this section, and these are just sections I'm playing with, I might change them, but anyway, I wanted to start off with heirs to Munch. So my first section references Edvard Munch, who died in 1944, and arguably the most dominant figure in Nordic art. However, in this first section, I'm concentrating on artists who produce woodcuts, mostly in the 1940s, the medium in which Munch excelled, and was a traditional method of making prints, particularly in Norway. I'm really pleased to begin the show with a woodcut by the Norwegian Sami artist John Savio. His prints depict life of Sami reindeer herders, and he was a great admirer of Munch. And he suffered from TB and died in poverty, sadly, at the age of the early age of 36. The other woodcuts that you can see here are by Henrik Fine, showing fishermen and men cutting up whale blubber. Harold Keeler, who uses white line for, you can see the beautiful print of a woman waiting for a bus, and two wonderful woodcuts by Wilhelm Tetterus. Now, I got to apologize for any of my mispronunciations of any of these names. So this is Wilhelm Tetterus, who was a dentist, but had a parallel career as a self-taught printmaker. So my next section looks at the post-war world, post-war life, urban life. And the first image that you can see is of Helhesten, the Danish magazine produced under the Nazi occupation in Copenhagen from 1941 to 1944. And some issues are filled with inserts of prints by artists who would go on to become part of the Cobra movement after the war. And I'm also showing you here prints from the 1950s by Danish artists Dan Stirrup Hansen and Sven Vig Hansen, who depicted isolated and anxious figures contemplating the bleakness of life after the war. On the bottom row are works by two female artists, Jane Mus and Vera Mura. Mus's print, the one you can see, the lower left, has this lovely title called Umbrella People Being Sucked into the Metro, and it's from 1967, and it's woodcut. And she has this uncanny ability to convey the mundane nature of everyday life with a great humor and sensitivity. So my next section concentrates on abstraction and concrete artists from the 50s and 60s. And I'm showing you here a print by Anna Bergman, one of Norway's most respected abstract artists. And if you were lucky enough to see her retrospective in Paris last year, you'll realize what a fantastic artist she is. And I think she's going to have an exhibition, the same exhibition is going to Oslo later on this year. Next to that is a print by Richard Mortensen, who spent the 50s in Paris and was part of the group of artists associated with the gallery Denise René, which became famous for showing concrete art. And that's a style which consists of colors and shapes that create a tension on a flat surface. And the other prints I'm showing you here are by Lars Gunnar Nordström and Ernst Mether Borgström, who are both pioneers of concrete art in Finland. And in the middle are two rare drawings by Johanna Blomstedt, the most significant Finnish abstract artist of his generation. And these are artists that people just don't know about, and they're great practitioners of concrete art. They're utterly amazing. And sorry about the quality of the slides, but I haven't had everything photographed properly, and these are awful images from my phone. I'm so sorry. But I hope you get the sort of impression of what I'm trying to show you. So moving on to the 60s and 70s with examples of political works. And here's the title page of the Grass portfolio. It's an important group of 15 screen prints produced in 1971 by the Grass, literally the Grass group. And you can see them amongst the grass in that title page. They were a print collective who worked out of a modest workshop in Oslo in the early 70s. And they were clearly influenced by American pop art, but their values and subject matter could not be more different, as the imagery they employ comes from a hard left sensibility. And a lot of the prints they made were against the Vietnam War. And below that, you can see a drawing by Siri Durkert. And she is one of the most groundbreaking artists of her generation. She's Swedish. She was a feminist, a communist, and an environmental campaigner. And one of her major works is this sandblasted concrete mural. It's 145 meters long. And she made that between 1962 and 1964 at Östermalmstorg metro station in Stockholm. And if you've ever seen it, or if you're ever going to Stockholm, I urge you to go and see it. It's absolutely fantastic. It contains messages of peace, names of feminist writers, musical notes from the Marseillaise and the Internationale, and many other images. And the one shown here is called The Family, and it's a drawing of part of the mural. So I obviously wanted to concentrate on Sami artists, and two of the best Sami artists working with works on paper are the first one I'm showing you is Britta Marikat Labbe. Now she actually makes embroideries, but she turns those into prints, and she's currently having a retrospective at the National Museum in Oslo. The image on the right that you can see is called The Crows, and it's from 1981, and it refers to the protest against the building of a dam on Sami land. And in Sami mythology, the crow symbolizes violent authority, and you can see them here swooping down gradually, turning into policemen battling with the protesters. It's an incredibly striking image. The next artist I'm showing you is called Thomas Kolbinson, a Swedish Sami artist like Britta Marikat Labbe. Kolbinson recently won the Queen Sonja Print Award, making him the first Sami artist to receive this prestigious prize. And that is a major, major big deal. For us outside of the Nordic countries, that is a major thing for a Sami artist to be honored in that way. He's a prolific printmaker and teacher. He uses photographs from archives, making these very complex and layered images. So this is my section on printmakers. I'm showing you prints by three female artists. The top, you can see works by Denke Rusova, she was a professor at graphics at the Norwegian Academy of Fine Arts in Oslo. Below on the left are two prints by Marianne Heske. She's known as a conceptual artist, but she learned how to make prints while she was living in Paris in the 70s. And the main motif in her prints is this doll's head, which she found in a flea market. And she calls it a symbol of humanity, and she uses it in all of her works in very interesting and inventive ways. And on the right is a print, which is one of my favorites. It's a print by Idun Baltzersen, and it was made last year, and it's from a suite of prints exploring the impact a baby makes on your life. And the artist, she's literally described motherhood as obliterating her personality. You can see the baby almost scratching her face. Oh, I'm doing this wrong. Oh, here we go. Right. So my next sort of category is looking at contemporary drawings, and on the left is a drawing by Jan Groth from 1971. He's obsessed with the exploration of line. He manipulates it mainly using black crayon or ink, but he also uses the white of the paper is almost as articulate as the line that he makes. And the work on the right is by someone called Mette Stausland. She was a dancer, but she got injured and she turned to drawing, and she creates these beautiful works that involve tension between mark making and erasure. I'm limited for time, because I could go on talking about these drawings. So I'm just quickly going through. So this is another section on contemporary drawings, two younger Swedish artists. The work on the left is a watercolor by Maria Nordin called Act of Comfort, and it's from 1922. It's watercolor, it's very big. The figure here, it's a self-portrait. She's carrying this impossible amount of clothing in each arm, and it's a sort of statement on the burdens of domestic life. And the other image on the right is by Anna Zimmerman, and she's very young. She was born in 1996, and this is called Venus, and it's from 1923. It's charcoal drawing. And again, it's very big. And she's inspired by old master paintings, and she makes the historical costumes for these meticulous charcoal drawings. As she works so slowly, she says she can't expect a model to sit for her for such long periods of time. So she never uses live models. Okay. So my next section I'm calling Contemporary Mavericks. I don't really like that title, but what I mean is these are works by artists whose practice isn't necessarily concentrated on works on paper that spread across several media. So the work on the left is by Swedish artist Joachim Nordström. He's renowned for his idiosyncratic style, mixing figures from the 19th century with 1950s buildings from Swedish suburbs familiar from his childhood. And the group of drawings on the right are by Aija-Liisa Attila, who is possibly the most famous contemporary artist working in Finland. And she works mostly with film. And these two sets of drawings can be read as storyboards for a film. She told me she just loves drawing, but she doesn't really use it in her practice. I was very lucky to get these drawings from her. So more contemporary mavericks. The work on the left is by John Corner. He is a Danish artist, and he has this ongoing, this is the lithograph here is part of an ongoing series of works called the Understanding the Impact of Architecture. And he comments on the thoughtless impact of man on nature in a witty but very powerful way. And on the right is a print by Ragnar Hjaltason, the Icelandic artist. His art practice covers mainly performance, but he loves making prints. And this is one of a series of very large woodcuts he made in 2022 at Niels Borch Jensen's workshop in Copenhagen. So this is my section on macabre and melancholy. Sverre Malin, he's a Norwegian artist whose drawing you can see on the left. He works incredibly slowly, making very precise and detailed drawings. He's inspired by Dürer and Holbein, but he also employs imagery from Norse mythology and the occult. He's obsessed with the occult. His flat in Oslo is like a kind of miniature of Leighton House Museum. He's obsessed with the late 19th century. He's obsessed with Aubrey Beardsley, and he's an incredibly interesting artist. But his gallery is very frustrated with him because they can never have a big show of his work because he works so slowly. The work on the right is by Jeff Olsen. Olsen is a Swedish artist. He's referencing the duality Scandinavians associate with the forest. It's interesting what you were saying, Isabelle, about the forest and what it means and what's in there and what isn't. It's both alluring and frightening, and it's a place to enjoy nature, but also to fear it. So on the left is a drawing by Vanessa Baird, my mother, from 2019. It's a huge watercolor. Baird is one of the most controversial contemporary Norwegian artists. She uses her family and intimate home life as her subject matter. And the complex emotions of caring for her mother have been at the core of some of her recent work. And the work on the right is by a young artist called Irina Charlotte Lindgren. It's from her Night, Night, Night series, and she excels in creating these unsettling but very beautiful atmospheric drawings by using just graphite as her main medium. And so this is my last section. This is nature and the environment. And on the left, you have a watercolor by Vibeke Slinstad, a Norwegian artist who also plays with scale and tightly crops her images, making the viewer feel as if they are part of the undergrowth. And on the right is a remarkable drawing, I think, by a Japanese artist called Yashiro Sato. It's called In the Air, and it's from 2019. He came over to Finland from Japan for an artistic residency, and he was so overwhelmed by the birch trees in the forest near where he was staying that he completely changed his style. And he's been making these intricate drawings of his surroundings ever since. He just keeps on drawing trees. He's just become obsessed with the birch tree. And my last image, this is a watercolor by Olafur Eliasson. It's called Don't Look to the Horizon, Look Down and Around. And it's a watercolor using glacial ice. And it's absolutely remarkable. It's a beautiful watercolor. You made it earlier this year, and it's a rare example of a watercolor by him. And he's used melted ice from chunks of ancient Greenlandic glaciers. And the ice is placed on top of thin washes of color on a thick sheet of paper. And as the ice gradually melts, the resulting displacement of the pigment produces an elegant and beautiful metaphor for the melting and disappearance of Greenland's glaciers due to the impact of global warming. And I thought I'd just end with an image of the artist signing the work. He made this work especially for the British Museum show. That's it. It's just to give you a quick snapshot of what I've been collecting.
Could I raise a question about authenticity and access, and how important is it in our understanding, because it gets cold up there, of actual presence in front of the motif? We know, for example, Peter Belka, one of his greatest themes carried out through his entire career is the North Cape, this great wall of rock jutting out into the Arctic Ocean. He goes there exactly once. He never leaves the ship he's on. He sits there, he draws it, then he goes away, and for 40 years, he returns to this motif that for so many Norwegians represents Norway. Not to be indiscreet, when we did our big Balka exhibition with the Nord-Norsk Kunstmuseum in Tromsø, the only exhibition I've ever done north of the Arctic Circle, it was magical. When we did in London, the King and Queen of Norway came, and I asked the Queen, have you ever been to the North Cape? And she said, oh yes, we fly over it every year in our helicopter on the way to our summer house. And yet it has this absolute centrality to a certain Norwegian sense of themselves. Certain things are the same in Canada, are the same in Sweden, are the same certainly in Finland, and yet not each one is a lived experience.
I can sort of add to that a bit more. So that's one of the sort of core things that I'm really interested in. I do a lot of work with scientists as well, more generally, not this work, but more generally. And one of the things scientists have a tendency, or especially with relation to glacial landscapes, is sort of using them as visual records of a glacial environment pre-photography. But the one thing they sort of don't remain cognizant of is, well, it's art. It's the artist, there's layers of interpretation, there's layers of creative license. And one of the examples I discuss in the book and have looked at previously is Johan Christian Dahl's view of Jostedalsbreen. And it's really significant because it's been taken by glaciologists and art historians as being representative of the glacier at this moment in time. But it's also important to note that it has two dates. It's 1839 and 1845, because he goes there in 1839, but then doesn't paint the painting until 6 years later. And so he's already painting a landscape that has ceased to exist, or has changed in some regard. A lot of the artists I look at have been within these environments, have been to these spaces, have done the traveling required to actually paint these landscapes. However, I think that adds still layers of complexity, because what we're seeing is still filtered through the art. These are not exact records of environmental history. They're useful tools for thinking through environmental history. But the layers of sort of authenticity, as you say, Chris, I think it's murky. It varies really from artist to artist in my experience.
Authenticity is a sticky word. So I guess even in the few Inuit examples that I showed, right, there's also an expectation, right, that Inuit art is a sealskin pouch, but is not an oil painting, let alone an oil painting from the 1800s. If most people's only connection to Inuit art is Canadian Inuit art, which is a very specific kind of narrative in a very specific place that happens in 1957. Invented by art. I mean, talk about the art market shaping art history. That's like the entire genesis of what this notion of Inuit art has kind of become. I think, but at the same time, right, a lot of these images of these white Scandinavian artists who travel to Clathnunat or travel to the Caribbean, because they are in this group of marine painters or this group of artists who go to places that are difficult to go to because of colonial bureaucracy. They need lots of special permissions to leave and to go there. Denmark, Norway makes very much sure that these are closed colonies that outsiders can't go to. So it means when they make images of their experiences in Nuuk or in Sisimiut or other towns, it already looks authentic enough, right? This is also what like Linda Nochlin says about Orientalism, right? In like the 1980s, right? Like the damning kind of dimension of what naturalism does in the 19th century, right? The fiction it produces. I think it's absolutely the same in these colonial power relationships. And also, right, the audacity, frankly, that that a lot of Danish artists who have this still happens today right now with Danish artists who travel to the Arctic on a 2-week residency, and then they paint polar bears and they paint icebergs. There are many, if you search Greenlandic art, it is much more likely you will find Danish images of polar bears and icebergs rather than art by actual Inuit who live there. So I think that I think authenticity is a sticky word.
I was really interested to see that 19th century painting from the Nuuk Art Museum that you showed, because whenever I've Googled them, I've only ever found Greenlandic artists, contemporary Greenlandic artists, mostly printmakers. And it's really interesting that I had no idea that that kind of work exists there. But then when I tried to buy works, these contemporary printmakers' works, you can't buy them. You can't, there's no dealers, there's nothing. It's almost as if they don't want to sell them. And they are producing the authentic work, and that's what I wanted to buy. That's what I want to buy. And it's interesting that we were talking about, I was saying, you know, I was very pleased to get those John Savio prints because he's a Norwegian Sami artist. And we were talking about that, the woman artist whose name I've forgotten now. Yeah, Amelia de Marthat, who's I kind of discovered and thought, how exciting, she's made wonderful prints of the Sami. But I can't, in this kind of climate and this kind of discussion, is there something kind of wrong about including her work in my exhibition? And I just kind of wanted to ask you about that.
There are definitely contemporary printmakers. I can tell you, I know exactly who you should talk to and the dealers you should talk to in Nuuk or Ilulissat. I think they would be very happy if they knew the British Museum might be interested. But right, like I know that because I have spent a lot of time there, facilitated through Danish foundations, to be there and have actual real relationships with people. I am like extremely close, like friends with the entire, all 3 employees of the Nuuk Art Museum. I have lived at the Nuuk Art Museum. There is like a residency bedroom. I have stuff there. So I think in those situations, I think like honest, real, and I talk about authenticity, being like honest with people, I think, and having relationships that aren't only transactional, especially in indigenous majority societies, where very often outsider engagement is very rarely towards the needs of these communities or these artists. It is also sometimes not accessible on the internet for a reason. So, but some of it is also that they're small societies. So, yeah, but we can talk. Because I think there would be a lot of artists that would be really excited.
Can I just add something on the Emily de Monthat angle? I think you touched on something really interesting there, and I was talking to Chris about it last night, and I referenced it in the book. So there was this exhibition that toured around Canada and the US, picturing the Americas, and it was staged at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And there's this wonderful commentary by Wanda Nanabush, who was previously a curator at the AGO until last year, and it's damning what she says. And she sort of says, you know, what's the point of this exhibition? Why are we now in 2010s putting on an exhibition that is 80 white artists on landscape painting of the Americas, from Puerto de la Fuego to the Arctic? That was the premise of the show. And as a landscape art historian who, the book is entirely about white artists, was both sort of in complete agreement with what she said, because the way in which the show framed these artworks was repeating the way in which art history had represented these works. And it's a fantastic jumping off point for somebody who is trying to provide a critical evaluation of landscape painting from the period, and sort of saying, well, if we just stop showing it, if we just stop putting these works on display, then we're not changing anything. We're just sort of saying that the way in which art historians have written about these works, have curated these works, that's all we have to say on it. And I would argue that there are a multitude of different and critical ways in which you can contextualize this work. And so I personally think you should absolutely consider including the work of Emily de Monthat, because while she is depicting Sami communities and is not Sami herself, her work is important because of the relationship she has with Johan Turi. It's important because she's one of few female artists working in the Arctic during the first half of the 20th century. And it says something important about the way in which artists from sort of the more sort of cultural centers within Scandinavia were engaging with the farther reaches of the Nordic region. And I think it's bringing that critical lens. I think if you've ever been to the Nordiska Museum in Stockholm and you went to the Arctic While the Ice is Melting show, which might still be on, I feel like it's been on an eternity now. But they use Emily de Monthat's work to illustrate Sápmi without providing any context that she is not a Sami artist. And I think it's doing that legwork. I think, as Bart's saying with Greenland as well, it's about making those steps that's really important. So yeah, sorry, just add that.
No, I completely agree. And that's why I was, I got very excited when she's a female artist, for God's sake, she's doing this very interesting work. Also, she's slightly too early for my show. It's a bit of a get out clause, but I mean, this exhibition is just to highlight what's going on and to get people interested and to bring out people like her. So possibly if I could find prints by her, I could acquire them in the future, again, building up our holdings. And she tells a completely different story, which, is a contribution. So you can't just kind of dismiss her. But so yeah, that's what I'm finding fascinating when I'm trying to collect this work. And I'm just hoping that, again, it's a jumping off point and people will delve deeper, having seen this kind of collection of Nordic art.
This leads me, because it's one of the most provocative aspects of your book. Those of us working who had been able to work in Nordic studies, particularly the whole question of Nordic painting, and God knows Canadian painting too, is tied in so profoundly with this question of national landscape, that landscape became the way in which a nation defined itself. And one of the things that you're saying that I find so provocative is that we have to move beyond this notion that it is a mode of essentially political self-discovery.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize, you can't rewrite history. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the way in which these works were purchased, curated, written about was very much from the perspective of the nation. And often artists were consciously working in such a fashion. And so, what I am really interested in and sort of argue is that, we have to remain, we have to still acknowledge that history. I mean, we were talking about the Canadian Group of Seven and the fact that it's the National Gallery of Canada that really start buying their work and give them that platform. But I think it's about, as well, showing the other histories and the other stories that exist beyond the national, because that's not the only story that can be told. And a lot of artists who perhaps haven't been given the attention they perhaps deserve. I think Anna Boberg is a perfect example of that. Most of her work, I mean, I think is now in Ben Elwes Fine Art, but also in the National Museum in Stockholm. And it isn't until the National Museum in Stockholm underwent its refurbishment that her work was really brought out on display. And I think, I mean, they might have changed it since. I haven't actually seen it, but the Northern Lights painting that's on the cover of my book was tucked away in a corner without any object label. It was just title, artist, date, no object label, just a blank space. And that for me was really indicative of the National Museum does not know what to do with a Swedish artist that fundamentally does not paint Sweden. Because how do you reconcile that national narrative when the artist who has recently been problematically described as Sweden's greatest painter doesn't really paint Sweden? And so you have to immediately disband national borders if you want to think about these sort of transnational connections, when you start to think about indigenous artists working within the Nordic region, especially because those national borders don't exist. They're very different. And so I think there's a lot of work still from a personal perspective. And I think, with the work you're doing, Bart, as well, that the national, the colonial is, I mean, it's so important to how you're approaching the sort of the extent and reach of Nordic art history.
I think that that national framework has also, of course, mapped onto even this new conversations about colonialism and empire, because then there's a strong focus on what is Danish colonialism? What are the Danish traces in the Caribbean? What are the Swedish traces of, what is it, like 80 years that Sweden has colonized St. Bart's in the Caribbean, a great name for an island, by the way. In a way that, or even, right, like what is, Denmark, Norway is an empire. The original missionary colonizer who was sent to Chattanooga is Norwegian, and yet is read as being Danish. So even these realities, just like actual facts, still somehow become these obstacles, or the main lens, I think, through which is viewing. So I think even just saying, what if not always, is still provocative. Yeah.
When Munch dies in 1944 in occupied Norway, it is turned into a great Nazi festival with bonfires on the hilltops, and he announces as kind of thing. So it's a very mutable thing, this sense of nationalism.
What I find very interesting, having come to this sort of quite late on in my career, and I'm obviously not an expert as the three of you, is that when I've gone to various Nordic countries collecting these works, I'm so surprised, because I mean, from the UK's point of view, we just lump everybody together. They are the Nordic countries, or Scandinavia. And I was just so struck by mentioning artists, like a famous artist in Norway, to somebody in Denmark and they'd never heard of them. And for me, that was, well, what's going on? Why is there this? And obviously you're through this whole kind of nationalism, this kind of, holding on to national identity is incredibly important in these countries. And I just don't think in the UK that we get that at all. We don't understand it. I just wondered if because we were talking about this just before we started this, how you've reacted to that. Have you been, struck and sort of what's going on? I mean, you're all so close to each other.
Maybe we should we
Open to
questions.
questions, please.
Hi, my name is Beate. I work in Nordic art for AKO Art Foundation. I just have an observation, and that is that I am actually Norwegian, not Swedish. Norway was under Denmark for 400 years. Then we were given away to Sweden. And only in 1905 did we become a country. So that, I think, explains a lot about why Norwegian artists were used and purposefully made art to nation build. And I think in Sweden it's very different because obviously they have been a big power. Russia, empire, exactly. And then you talk about colonization, also that Norway has been colonized by 2 Nordic countries. So I think that is sort of a throw-in comment to make it a bit more interesting. And also, Jenny, when you say in Britain that you kind of look at each other as one, I don't think the Welsh think so. Or the Scottish. So thinking about it from a Norwegian point of view, I think it's a different where you come from. Thank you.
I'll just add something and say, you're absolutely right. And I think what we're saying is that, the national is important from a historical context in understanding the environment in which these works, the cultural and social and political environment in which many of these works were produced and how they were then used. As you say with Norway, Dal and Balke become even more important when Norway gains independence because they become a way, and we see those artists during the second half of the 19th century as a way of making a stand about Norwegian national identity. And I think what we're sort of saying is, or at least what I'm saying, I don't want to speak for everybody, is sort of saying that these rhetorics are historically important. But I think many of us would agree in today's environment, we need to make a shift away from the national, especially in how we think about land. And so when we're thinking about landscape and environment, I think it's really important that we start to sort of dissolve the rhetoric, the narrative around how we frame these works. And just to sort of offer ways of thinking about it going forward, not necessarily provide sort of solutions. But so thank you so much for contributing that, because I do agree.
Oh, am I? Sorry. Hi. Is really, Isabelle, is there a critical framework in terms of latitude, of what's going on in Russia at the time? Is there much activity art historically looking at some similar things that you've been looking at?
Well, I mean, I can briefly say, I mean, yes, there is. There is, I mean, I think this is one of the difficulties. I mean, for me, it was a very conscious decision as an art historian of the Nordic countries to push the opposite direction of Russia, not because of Russia per se, but I felt that that's the way in which Nordic art history has historically leaned. It's, the work has been Nordic countries and Russia as sort of an extension, especially with the Finnish-Russian border. And there are some incredible Russian artists, especially working in the Arctic during the first decades of the 20th century. But this is where I think the work you're doing, Bart, don't laugh. The work you're doing in thinking about the US, thinking about Alaska in relation to Russia more historically, I think is really pushing the boundaries on how we might start to encompass Russia more generally in a conversation of circumpolar art history.
Yeah, I guess I would just say briefly, some of that comes from The fact I've spent also a lot of time in the Baltic states. So if we think about like latitude as something of like shared landscape or shared experience, right? Like the same northern light that is always used to describe Nordic painting. Wow, that northern light is also the same northern light in Estonia and Latvia. But in the late 80s, early 90s, when people are learning about Nordic art, they are not learning about Baltic art for really, deliberate reasons, right? These are newly independent nations. They're now post-Soviet nations. They are incredibly impoverished in the early 90s. It's not a coincidence that now, after joining the EU in 2004, after the adoption of the euro, all three of them, that there are now international shows framing Baltic art in a new way. That Nordic art had been talked about, but Baltic artists, as part of the Russian Empire, are equally sort of entangled in these Nordic, and on the art market in the 19th century, they're competing with each other about who can be a more popular snow painter. And it becomes very contentious at the end of the 19th century. But I think that latitude has been easy to ignore for a long time because of the Cold War. And now again, of course, because of the invasion, right, of Ukraine, which exacerbates, right, these kinds of connections. But I think it's a really great connection because I think in an ideal world, right, we would be talking about that. But I think the kind of geopolitical reality is we're not.
It's actually better without. Isabelle, you said that that the National Museum was speaking about Boberg, that the reason why something like 300 paintings by Anna Boberg is not on display in the National Museum. You suggested that that's because that the Swedes or the National Museum dismiss works by Swedish artists depicting foreign subjects. Did I get that right? Or?
Well, no, I think that was more of a statement on why I think Anna Boberg has perhaps been neglected from the study of Swedish art history more generally.
But I don't think that's the actual reason. I think she's been neglected simply because she's a female artist. But if you walk into the National Museum in Stockholm and you walk through room to room, from room to room, you will see that they display art by Swedish artists painted in Germany, the beginning of the 19th century, in Italy, painted in the beginning of the 19th century, and then in the second half of the 19th century, most Swedish artists left Düsseldorf for France, and the walls are adorned by landscapes by Swedish artists depicting French landscape. Chris mentioned Carl Fredrik Hill. Carl Fredrik Hill, almost all his pictures, oil paintings, depict French subjects, and they're very popular in Sweden. They're all displayed in various museums. So I don't think that's the actual reason.
See, I think Henry, you and I will keep having this conversation after this, because I actually think you've kind of hit the nail on the head, that it's Sweden in relation to continental Europe. It's Sweden in relation to the art centers of Germany, France, and Italy, and not Sweden in relation to its Nordic neighbors. And I'm not saying, by the way, that my hypothesis on Anna Boberg is the only one. I think the fact that she's a female painter has a large part to do with it. Also, the fact that she's perhaps overshadowed in Swedish art history by her architect husband, Ferdinand Boberg. But I think I think this is a conversation we can keep having about the tensions at play in the way in which the National Museum in Stockholm in particular positions Swedish art in relation to a wider European art history.